Hey everybody. I did my paper on radical perspectivism and how it can be used to combat the ecological crisis. So, individual perspectivism or regular perspectivism is an idea that knowledge is very limited and based on individual perspectives. So, my perspective is somewhat or very different from another person's perspective, and some of these differences can give rise to issues. Um, and give rise to problems, whether it be the environment or in relationships or whatever. So I wanted to look at how radical perspectivism might be used to see if we can maybe overcome some of these differences or smooth out some of these differences. So I looked at three different radical perspectives. One is by a Chinese Taoist philosopher named Shuangzi. The second is by an anthropologist named Eduardo Viveros de Castro, who we read a little bit about in the course. And he did some research on Latin American indigenous cultures who he claimed they had radical perspectives on certain things. And the final one is a Zen Buddhist philosopher named Dogen. So for Chuangzi, Chuangzi was really all about collapsing dualities. He was a radical skeptical philosopher, and he said, we're claiming that we know certain things, but we really don't know a lot of these things that we're talking about. One of the examples that he used was the difference between life and death. So he said we put ourselves through a lot thinking about death, thinking about how we're going to die, and he said, we don't really have any idea if it's better or worse or different from life at all. We just don't know. So why are we causing ourselves to suffer? So he talked about having no judgment. And one of these ideas would be don't have any judgment about death because you really don't know what it's like to die. So he said, in terms of perspectivism, we are locked into our bodies. We are locked into the time and the space that we're in. And this idea gives rise to um, our own individual ways of seeing things. And we can't really get outside of those things because we can't get outside of our bodies and we can't get outside of the time and the place that we're living in. So that idea that we have these individual perspectives gives rise to narrow-mindedness, but it gives rise to prejudice. And the only way we can drop this prejudice, he says, was by having no judgment. And it's a very difficult idea to wrap your head around what it might mean to have no judgment. So he said, one of the things that we can think about is lesser and greater knowledge. And lesser knowledge is an individual perspective. It is a very narrow-minded perspective. But greater knowledge are perspectives that take on multiple ways of thinking. So they are by definition greater. So in this way, he's trying to get out of sort of a relativist trap, and he's saying that greater knowledge, greater perspectives, having more and more perspectives um, is much more preferable than being narrow-minded and having fewer perspectives. So the second radical perspective that I talked about is the Amerindian cultures, some of the Amerindian cultures, and work done by Eduardo Viveros de Castro. And he mentions that some of these cultures see non-human animals as very different beings because they see themselves as very different beings. So there's an idea in Western culture that evolution has taught us that humanity has evolved out of the animals. And this gives us a different way of looking at animals. We might see animals as less than. We might see animals as quite different from us. We might see animals as inferior. But these cultures do not see it that way. In fact, they see personhood everywhere they look. So if all are people and all are treated as people and all consider themselves to be people, in that way, the difference between human animal and non-human animal has been collapsed. And a there's not as much a need to look at humans as being um, having unique essences compared to animals. So we see ourselves in some ways as very similar to animals, and this changes the way we treat the animals around us. It changes the way we treat the world around us, and that's a very different way of looking at the animal world. If you see animals around and you try to think about their perspectives and you try to think about the way they're seeing themselves and the way they see us, um, it gets you out of your head a little bit and you're not thinking from your own perspective. You're trying to put yourself in the place of animals around you. I think it can be a very valuable way of trying to understand the animal world. And by extension, we understand the animal world, then we might better understand or better care for the habitat of the animals. So the third and final radical perspective is Dogen's egolessness perspective. And he talked about two things. He talked about a lot of things, but I talk about two things in the paper. I talk about what we call, or what Buddhists call, emptiness, and also what Buddhists call Buddha nature. And Dogen relied a lot on talking about emptiness, but he also radically revised the way a lot of people look at what Buddha nature is and what Buddha nature means. So, to talk about emptiness is another way of simply saying that that things do not have any fixed essences, about that things are always changing. There's always impermanence in the world, and there's nothing but flux and process in the world. So there is no fixed core of any particular individual or of anything for that matter. And so when we think about the ways that we think of things, why should we really have fixed ways of thinking as well? If I or anyone or anything else around me is not a fixed individual, why should my own thought processes be fixed? So this really tries to get us away a little bit of narrow-mindedness, and I think it is telling us to open up a little and listen to other people, to not cling to my own specific views, but to listen to other people and to listen to the world around me. Those are ways that I can open up. Those are ways that I can change. Those are ways that I can be more aware and more compassionate of things around me. In terms of Buddha nature is what many Buddhists say, that all beings have this fundamental capacity to awaken, and that's what they call Buddha nature. But there has always been a little bit of a disagreement about who has Buddha nature. Some Buddhists say that Buddha nature is for sentient beings only. Dogen was really one of the first Buddhists to come out and say that it's not just sentient beings that have a Buddha nature. Even insentient beings have a Buddha nature. And he actually said it's not even that beings have Buddha nature, it's that beings are Buddha nature. So these are radically different ways of conceiving of already radical ideas. So the idea of Buddha nature, to begin with, I think is kind of a radical idea. But Dogen is going even further with all of that. So if you take the perspective, the radical perspective, that insentient beings and sentient beings have Buddha nature and are Buddha nature, then it can really revolutionize the way you see the world around you and the way you think about the world around you. If we all have this capacity to awaken, and we're all special in that way, then it really doesn't make sense to engage in environmental degradation. It really doesn't make sense to see other people and other things as separate from ourselves. So it is a very radical way of reorienting yourself in the world. One of the things that I tried to point out in the paper was that a lot of people talk about the ecological crisis, but I want to sort of rethink this crisis and say that it's actually a personal crisis. It's a spiritual crisis. And there's an environmental lawyer named Gus Speth who said for years he thought that the eco crisis was about biodiversity loss and climate change or burning of fossil fuels. But he actually now understands that it's a spiritual crisis. And he says that some of the main problems that we have in terms of this spiritual crisis that's creating the ecological crisis, some of the biggest vices to overcome are the vices of selfishness, apathy, and greed. And I tried to connect the opposites of these vices. You might say they're the virtues of selflessness and compassion and also generosity, and how all of these radical perspectives in different ways talk about selflessness and generosity. Whether it's Dogen talking about emptiness, this is a way of talking about selflessness, or whether it is this idea of opening up and being compassionate to other people around you, this is a way of talking about being generous. And obviously, to do any of those things, you can't be apathetic to the world. You have to actually care about the world around you. So a radical perspective, I think, can really help turn a lot of those vices that he mentions into virtues. One other thing I mentioned, I talk about the paradigms of the society around us. We seem to be based on largely a mechanistic paradigm and a materialistic paradigm. And I talk about how radical perspectives can get us away from mechanism and can have us seeing things more from a perspective of organism or process philosophy. And I also talk about how we can get away from materialism, from scientific materialism, and we can think more about animism. And we can try to include the human world with the non-human world, and we can try to include also the insentient world as well. And so radical perspectivism then, hopefully, in my view, can turn around some of these paradigms that seem to be perhaps a little destructive or perhaps a little narrow-minded in terms of the way we see the world or the way we think about the world. And these types of perspectives can open us up to new ways of seeing things. So, in general, the paper is about broadening our horizons, awakening our compassion, and trying to reorient our perspectives in the world and try to re-envision the world in different and more loving ways that are more belonging, more compassionate, that are based more on this idea of relationship. And it's not a mechanistic way of saying that things are divided or things are separate, but it's more about togetherness. So those are some of the things that I discussed in the paper, and thanks a lot, guys, for listening. And I do look forward to reading all of your papers and listening to all of your presentations. So thanks again.